Today is Friday, June 23rd, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. How are you doing today, Mr. Smith?
I'm doing fine, Mr. John D. Robinson. How are you?
Well, after my third attempt at the intro, I'm doing better. What do we have on tap for our listeners today?
Well, today, and this is partially motivated by requests from two different listeners who requested the same thing. We are going to talk about some of the ways love is weaponized by both society and individuals. Thank you, Jake and Julia, and welcome everyone again to the podcast. And it is great to be here. And actually, this is the first full day back this week for my co-host here, Mr. Robinson, who had taken what is normally a bit of a relaxing excursion earlier in the week, but it wasn't quite as relaxing this week, was it, Mr. Robinson?
No, God gives us the opportunity to have the complete experience in our lives many times. Now I know the answer to what would happen if you went camping and it rained the whole time. It didn't literally rain the whole time, but it for all intents and purposes did. And the one truly enjoyable thing about it that's the most therapeutic to me is sitting creekside and when it's pouring rain. In fact, the creek rose so high that you couldn't even do that. Even if you're willing to ford out there with the rain and everything, you're sitting, in the water. Well, you'd have to see the setup, but the creek was just far too high and lots of bugs.
Well, in Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin's dad would say that was for building character. So you got to build some character. That was your time.
It just by Thursday when we packed up. We went. It was bad enough we left a day early, and you're packing up in the rain, and the whole time reinforcing the idea that it is time to get out of here.
Yeah.
And then you get to the point where you don't even notice that you're wet anymore, practically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and we were enjoying that rain here, and it was great. I love rain, but I don't like rain when I'm trying to camp. And it wasn't. I'll admit I didn't think of you the first day, Mr. Robinson, but the second day or so, it hit me. It's like, oh, hey, they're out. I wonder if this is affecting them. I wasn't really sure. I didn't really look at the map to see how far that went.
We, like the tents are pretty secured and waterproof.
That's good.
And we have a sitting area it's secure, and there's facilities nearby for the bathroom and everything. But man, unless you just want to sit under a tent all day long, it's not that much.
And that's
fun.
not why you were there.
There's elements of it that are fun. Like we still
Of course.
enjoyed ourselves, and I don't actually regret going out there. Yet that's not the experience we were looking for.
Right. I get it. Well, the experience everyone is here looking for is us to comment and say something fruitful and useful on this topic. And this topic that we have today about weaponized love, if you will, was recommended by more than one person. And when I say that, a facet of this, as we were thinking about it, like the topics that were mentioned were the idea of self-love and this idea that society is pressing on people that you need to love yourself first. That's so important. But I was thinking about it more broadly, and then I saw in Starbucks during one of my many jaunts to Starbucks, there was a woman there, kind of a regular, an older gal, and perhaps because it's Pride Month, quote unquote, she had a shirt on that was clearly with this kind of pride flag colors, and it had in big words on the front of the shirt the phrase, "Love is my religion." And I thought, man, exactly that is this messed up idea, because you're trying to say, well, I know your religious beliefs probably discriminate and make you a bigot, but you know what my religion is? It's love, actually loving other people. And it called to mind again these kind of comments that came in terms of request for a topic, because love, real love, actual love, is indeed a positive thing. It's a good thing. If you look in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 16, it says there that God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. So love, real, actual love, absolutely is a good thing. But this idea is perverted by so many people, and they want to take all the good things that are collected around the word love, and then they want to redirect those things to other things. Yet in the very same book, just here in the intro, I want to hit two hard things. This very same book by the Apostle John, 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, he says further, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. And again, in the very same book, you go earlier, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 5, he says, but whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. And it means the word of God in that case. By this we know that we are in him. So yeah, real love is wonderful. It's a reflection of God's own nature and who he is. But the idea of love, which we think of so positively, because we think of it positively, it's used against us in a variety of ways. It's weaponized, if you will, to maneuver us or to manipulate us. And especially if you're young, you teens and young adults who are listening, you have been awash in this weaponization of love for, frankly, a large part of your life. And so we thought we'd take some time here on the podcast to talk about that.
Well, why don't we take a moment? I think it might be beneficial for us to attempt to define what we think this person means, what this shirt means by my religion is love. You know, what would you say that a person wearing a shirt like that, and those that are kind of in this category of, frankly, I mean, I would characterize it as like cloaking their worldview in an idea of love. I don't know if that's the best way to put it. But so when I hear something like love is my religion, what do they really mean? I find that generally means I can live any way I want. And if you object to that, then you're kind of a hateful person.
Yeah, you're
bigoted
a hater,
in some
you're
way.
a bigot, you're something like that.
So
Absolutely.
to them, love is being able to act in any. I'm trying to avoid being snarky at all.
Right.
I would use the word perverse, but if I wanted to avoid that, you know, any activity, any way I want to live my life, regardless of what it is or what the consequences are, that's love. If I think you should be able to live your life that way, then you must love me, and then this kind of thing. And you and I, that's immediately a red flag to us, because we have a much greater understanding of what true godly love is.
Right.
And it's almost the opposite of, you really struck a chord with me this morning when you reminded me in our discussion of this that God's law is the law of liberty. And it's funny because did you hear about the nuns, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence?
I did. I mean, all of our listeners may not.
Okay,
but I regrettably did.
Okay, I thought it was kind of interesting because it showed up on ESPN, and I read their thing. And what's funny is here's what the group's mission statement says that they are. They're a nonprofit devoted to community service, ministry, and outreach to those on the edges, and to promoting human rights, respect for diversity, and spiritual enlightenment. We use humor and irreverent wit to expose the forces of bigotry, complacency, and guilt that chains the human spirit. So they very literally think the idea of God's laws, any kind of limitation, is slavery to something. And that kind of gets into a sticky, the way Paul talks about a slave to one thing or slave to another. But we understand that God's law of liberty actually frees us from the very things that they think are holding them back, or the things they think is love is the opposite of what it is really.
Yes. I think you're right. In answer to your question there that was at the core of everything you're saying, what does that mean for someone? And it actually would be an interesting thing to ask. Explain to me, if I'd been bold enough, maybe I would have struck up a conversation there, but I was on my way to work, and definitely I might have felt a little heated at times. But asking, so what does that mean for love is your religion? Well, and it's going to blend into the first point we're going to make today about one of the ways love is weaponized. But I do think that generally it means, well, no matter how someone wants to live their life and no matter what they're doing, that you're okay with that you accept them and you love them, and you don't make them feel ashamed. They don't think the word castigate, but castigate them. Whatever lifestyle they believe is authentic for them, that you will embrace it. If anything, help them and support them in living that lifestyle. Now, when it comes to brass tacks, as some used to say way back when. Now, you ever use the phrase brass tacks?
Yeah, I have, but I don't know why it's brass.
I admit I have no idea. And I'm afraid if I ask our listeners, so many of them are going to know, and they're going to think we're dumb for not knowing. But,
there's an unfollow.
Feel gently willing to, we'll probably look it up by the end of the program, but feel gently willing to let us know by the end of the program if we don't know. But if you really get down to it, most of what they're saying is they want you to embrace some kind of perversity or something that is against God's law. Because, like, for instance, if they knew someone who, say a terrible man who routinely abused his family and beat his wife, well, they don't want you to embrace that. They don't want you to, oh, you just need to accept him for who he is. Well, no, they want to put that guy in jail, or they want to, get him to some counseling or something to help. It's generally things, usually, sadly, of a sexual nature, but that tend to go against God's law, and that you're not loving if you don't accept that. And that really is the first way of the few ways we're going to talk about today that love tends to be weaponized. Love tends to be weaponized, using it like a weapon to get people to tolerate sin.
Yeah.
And I would say more than they use the word tolerant, but they mean more than tolerate.
Right.
They mean embrace.
Yep.
They mean to fully accept.
Well, I had a conversation with somebody in the 90s, and we were talking about this, and he pointed out to me, which was such a great point, which was they don't mean tolerant anymore. And this was in the 90s. Tolerance means, you're going to live, or you're going to do whatever it is you're going to do, and I will not try to stop you. That's kind of tolerance.
Yeah, but I don't mind. I'm around someone who I find maybe, we have people around us who are grating, or they're irritating, or we think they're rude, but we don't kick them out of our store necessarily. We tolerate that.
Right.
That the fact that you disagree makes you a tolerant person, right? Agreeing and accepting, you're not tolerating anymore. You're not putting up with something.
So but where we've progressed to in this society, which I don't think this is anybody would even argue against this anymore. Why do we have cancel culture? Cancel culture means, we've moved far beyond tolerance into, if you don't accept this, then you have an unacceptable view, and therefore you should not be listened to. You should not have a platform for anything.
We will not tolerate you saying that in our society. Right?
That's the irony, isn't it?
It is, and some of them embrace it. There's actually, I can't recall, I want to say it's related to some Marxist thought, go figure. But I do know there's actually a line of thinking where someone has said, is a philosopher. I should have looked it up before this, but I didn't know where we're going here. Where essentially said that in order to maximize tolerance, we have to be intolerant of some things. And then it's fairly objective. Subjective. What are you intolerant of?
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, you're fundamentally not a tolerant society. You've just decided what you'll tolerate and what you don't, just like every other society.
And so what we've seen is the way in which it's been weaponized is if you hold any kind of traditional Judeo-Christian value anymore, you're almost by definition hateful and intolerant. If
you're
you don't
unloving. That's right.
You're bigoted. You're a homophobe. I love we're using everything incorrectly. Transphobe, afraid of trans people. I'm not afraid of trans people or homosexual people, but any kind of stance against that in any way publicly. I mean, I'm sure our listeners can think of on their own many people who've briefly taken a stance, been ridiculed, had apparently, if you're canceled, it's really something. I keep using the term canceled for just, attacked for your views. But, people fill up your Twitter timeline or your Instagram, comments and all this kind of thing. And it's really tough from what I understand, if you've never encountered it before. I mean, we can sit here and think, that doesn't sound good. But apparently it's really something when they come after you.
Oh, yeah. And it really, when you really look at how people are come after, if they're perceived as intolerant of certain sinful behaviors, it's very unloving, the behavior of the people coming after them, which is ironic because that's what they're saying. They've taken this idea of love, they've falsified it, and they've used it as a tool to coerce people into accepting sins and harmful behaviors and lifestyles. So I can't remember what baseball player it was, but there was a baseball player who spoke out it was fairly recent. Maybe you saw it. It was
I think there was a couple. I do think one of the LA Dodgers, because the nuns of perpetual indulgence,
quote unquote nuns, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. They were what blows me away about that. Let me just mention this one thing about it, and I've covered up my notes. they were going to be presented a Community Hero Award.
And yeah, for those listeners who don't understand what they do, they put on perverted displays, mocking religion. What Mr. Robinson read about their purpose is very sanitized. It's like the best way you could possibly falsely interpret it. But they are actively anti-religion, especially Catholicism. And we're no fans of Catholicism, but why do they do that? Because they're trying to tear apart all standards. I saw them mocking the crucifixion, all sorts of things. And here the Dodgers are going to present them an award for that.
There's very heroic behavior. But I think you're right. I think one of the Dodgers pitchers spoke out against it finally, and there was such a backlash this time for once that he seems to have gotten away with being against it, because it's so interesting. I know that we're way off the podcast now, but as of right now, the only group I see pushing back against this and getting away with it is the Catholic community. I think probably in this case specifically is they were clearly mocking nuns, cross-dressing up as nuns and doing perverted things, and finally somebody spoke up about it, and in this case, it was the Catholic community. They were like, hey, listen. So it wasn't even that what they were doing is perverted. It's you're mocking our religion.
Oh, yeah. In that particular case, they actually, a whole bunch of Catholics came out in mass and protested and actually seemed to make a thing. But it's actually not what I'm thinking of. The baseball player I'm thinking of is Anthony Bass. I just looked it up. He was a pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays. And he had shared what was considered an anti-LGBTQ post on social media. Now, if I recall, because I think I saw reading the original post, it was something about supporting the Target boycott. That's all it was, was something about that, about Target putting the trans clothing up front for children, which is still there. It's just you got to look for it. It's just not at the very front of the store. And he had reposted, I think retweeted or something in support of, maybe he personally said something in support of the people trying to influence Target not to put that stuff front and center. And boy, the hammer came down and he apologized. He apologized to the media and said he didn't realize he would be offensive. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it was one of those kind of caving in apologies, because he was potentially at risk of being canceled and of facing those kinds of things.
Right.
And so that's the loving response to those kind of comments, because especially coming around Pride Month, quote unquote, in June, Pride Month is virtually a holy season for this kind of idea that love means accepting all those things. So if you don't fully embrace and accept homosexuality as completely normal and fine, then supposedly you hate homosexuals. You're not loving. If you don't fully embrace or accept transgenderism as okay, then you hate those who believe that they are trans. Supposedly to love someone, you have to find out what their pronouns are, whether they're he or him or she or her or z or zim or all the other pronouns. That loving someone means completely accepting however they identify themselves in whatever way. And really, when you look at it, it does go further than that. Like society's wondering, and this affects things on a policy level and a society level, what does it mean to love drug addicts? Well, loving drug addicts, what does that mean? It'll turn into making sure they have clean needles, so that they don't get diseases while they're shooting up. Or what does it mean to love the homeless? Well, when you see these tent cities cropping up, places that are just piling up homeless people in some areas of major, like Los Angeles, in that area, where they're living these degraded lives, and law and order is falling apart, and there's footage of people like trying to do drugs and using water out of the street, to put in their syringes, people literally destroying themselves, but somehow that's loving them, to allow that to happen is absolutely perverted. But let me bring it down from that scale to a smaller human scale. It sometimes, and people may think this is completely unrelated, and maybe I'll offend everybody at this point, but hopefully not. When you have a child that you won't discipline and you won't correct because you don't want them to feel bad, or, you're kind of constantly caving to what they want. Well, then that's love, to tolerate all this misbehavior, and not actually to correct them and shape them, when the Bible actually speaks to the opposite of that. In Proverbs 16 and verse 18, it says, chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. And that's part of what we want to talk about. Love doesn't mean just completely accepting everything that someone does. To love someone who is living a self-destructive lifestyle that is coming between them and God, that doesn't mean just embracing it. No, it's the opposite of that. And, actually, I should let Mr. Robinson read it because he's the one that called it to mind. We were putting the notes together. I think Proverbs 27 speaks to that directly.
Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful.
Proverbs 27:6. Right. The idea that if your friend is faithful, then sometimes your friend's got to be willing to say, I am sorry, but I do not agree with what you're doing, and it's wrong. I love you, but the reason I'm saying these things is because I love you too much to let you continue going down that path without saying something about it.
I'm just gonna take the hits, take the chance with mentioning author and clinical psychologist Jordan B. Peterson, but one of his clinical interests was child development, and he says, when you look at what you see going on in Western civilization and lots of poorly adjusted adults, he more or less says it's from this kind of idea. It's kids, they grew up in a far too permissive society, and they grew up. He says basically what we have is a bunch of people that adults that got stuck at the age of 8 or 10 or 12 and never really fully grew up because they weren't.
Interesting.
I don't want to overly characterize what he's saying, but as much as it was not enjoyable growing up to get disciplined by your parents and your father in particular, man, I wouldn't trade it for anything for the most part. I mean, you will not grow up into the healthiest version of yourself if you don't have somebody putting some boundaries. Yeah, and early. Well, that was the other thing. He said between the age of 2 and 4 is absolutely critical. If a child has not learned how to play with other kids where he's accepted by the other kids, that's kind of a narrow window where if that socialization does not occur, it's almost impossible to get that all the way back. And so those people go into being adults incapable on some degree of really being able to socialize properly. And then they get all the more frustrated and everything. And it all kind of goes back to, I hate to say bad parenting, but I mean, there's an element of that.
At least making unwise choices, right? And that's part of the message is just simply tolerating these things in your child and not trying to do anything about it. It's easy to think that's loving them. Oh, well, they're so young, and it's like, well, no, loving a child actually means guiding them and shaping them and representing the way the world should be to them. And I thought of this example, this Canadian father, and I won't say his name, but you can look up his name in the news, but he's currently under arrest in Canada. I was getting an update on his case just recently, and absolutely is still under arrest because his ex-wife, I think it's his ex-wife, and his daughter wanted her to start hormone therapy and go by a different name. And the courts in Canada actually required of him, like a gag order, required him to call her by her boy name that she wanted, required him to speak publicly of her only using the pronouns she wanted, he and him. And he refused to do that, and he refused to be quiet about that, and he will not call his daughter by her boy, the name that she wants because she thinks she's a boy. And what does the world paint this as? Sticking with our topic, oh, how hateful of him, how abusive of him. In fact, you're really looking at laws they're trying to pass in California that essentially try to depict things like that as if it's child abuse, versus a father who says, look, if I'm the last voice of sanity that my daughter is going to hear, and if I have to be under arrest to do that, then that's what I'm going to do. If this is the last witness that I can give my daughter that you're headed towards self-destruction,
right,
and this is the price I have to pay, actually that kind of self-sacrifice, that's kind of what love is doing that.
Well, Jordan Peterson's rise to fame was over his objection to Canada's compelled speech law, Bill C-16, which required that. And when he was pushing back on it, I watched he was even on TV. Somebody said, oh, what's the big deal? You just get cited. There's not jail or anything. And he said, what if I don't pay the fine? because ultimately it does come
It's
back
still
to that.
punitive. Oh,
And so
absolutely.
now here, and that was in like 2016, 2017, something like that. I
Yeah.
should look it up. And here we are 6-7 years later. It's exactly what he objected to, is it's compelled speech.
Yeah, I know. In terms of doing the work, I was actually reading some of the text in C16 recently, just in terms of trying to do the work carefully and doing it right. So we don't want to linger on this one because we have other points to make. But the point is, in terms of the ways that love is weaponized, this is one. Society is trying to weaponize love to convince you that you're a hateful, bigoted, unloving person unless you embrace all of these perverse lifestyles and other things. And the fact is, rather, real love means being willing to say uncomfortable things and say, I love you, but that is not God's way, and I can't support you in this. I can't get behind you in this. So be willing to be a faithful friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Proverbs 27:6. And that doesn't mean literal wounds, by the way, just so you know. God is speaking there metaphorically. But we'll go with that. All right, the second one, and this one is a little more personal. It's not society level here, but another way in which love is weaponized is as a mask for personal selfishness. A mask for personal selfishness. And this actually brings us to, we didn't really at the very beginning of this define what love is, but maybe there's an opportunity to do that. Mr. Herbert Armstrong, among the many things he said, which were just plain catchy and stick in your head because they were so well stated and so succinct, one of the things that he said was that love is outgoing concern for others.
You know, the first time I heard that, I had two thoughts.
Okay.
One, I'm like, really? But two, even at the time, I recognized, well, that's a pretty good definition. Like, I can understand that. Like, at least it hit me and that made sense. But I wasn't sure. I was like, that's too simple. But here I am, like 35 years later, and I have never heard a better definition of it in some ways.
You know, and
in terms of a simple, concise explanation.
I agree. There's times I'd hear that. I remember early on hearing it and think, well, it's kind of simple. I mean, I was pretty simplistic, and yet I've actually heard it in different words, but this exact same concept from some of the highest brow people I know. I've mentioned to you, Mr. Robinson, personally. One day maybe I'll tell the story of getting to meet Dr. William Lane Craig, one of my favorite mainstream, regrettably Christian apologists, but just a wonderfully smart guy and really good at arguing about God's existence.
Sorry, I think I've done more to just pull the podcast off the topic but he is actually an excellent apologist in terms of in certain areas.
Yeah, he is. He is.
His debate with Ben Shapiro over was Jesus Christ the Messiah was excellent.
Good. I really am a fan. Again, I don't agree with all of his doctrines, but I did get to meet him personally once at an NRB convention. And at that convention, he presented an argument is actually a discussion about Islam, but he was presenting an argument for why there's a multiplicity in the Godhead, which we don't believe in a Trinity. And of course, he does. However, he didn't argue for a Trinity. He just argued that the Godhead needed to have more than one person. And I'm getting to the point here in a second, which I did ask him later. He didn't come up with that argument. He was actually an argument he'd heard from someone else. And I asked him later, have you ever heard an argument at all anywhere in natural theology and such apologetics that the Godhead must be three persons specifically? He at least thought was a sound argument. And he said no. He said actually he hadn't. I thought it was very interesting.
That is interesting.
But in particular, this argument is that there should be more than one, and it's based on what is often called different ways to put it. I'll just say the idea that if God is the greatest moral being in the universe or entity, of the pinnacle of goodness, the pinnacle of truth, all those things we believe God is, kind of greatest being approach. Well, if God is love, which the Bible says God is love, what is love? Love is outgoing concern. And if he is to have possessed that quality, to have been love, to exemplify love for all of his existence in eternity, well, that has to be outflowing. There has to be an object of that. In fact, God couldn't be love. This is an argument. I'm not saying this is the Bible, without there being an object of that love. And so that would kind of require, if God is supposed to represent love, if he not represent, if he is truly the height of that, there has to be an object for that. And it makes sense. It would have to require actually there be more than one God being, which of course we know there are two. There's the ones we now know as God the Father and Jesus Christ. And Mr. Armstrong would long say that their relationship was an eternity, loving each other, right? And together, of course, they chose to make us. So a little abstract there, but I thought it was interesting because in that argument, he actually defined love, not in these exact words like Mr. Armstrong did, but virtually the same, where love is an outgoing concern. And if you don't have someone to love, you're not loving. Loving is an outgoing concern for other people.
That's also a key. I'm amazed how often we can actually route things back to doing the work. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there were some organizations that kind of took the tact of, well, we need to kind of care for ourselves. The body, that is, the bride needs to get herself ready and prepare herself.
Right.
And so kind of it turns to an internal focus, and it does truly become internal. It's not outflowing anymore.
Right.
Whereas the true bride of Christ is out there actively doing the work. And what is the work? I mean, it's spreading the good news of Christ. I mean, it's naturally outflowing. I mean, we spend a lot of money getting the message out on TV and
time, energy, effort. Absolutely. Now, of course, it's not just outflowing anything. It's outflowing concern for others. And that's where we get into this second point, because here we're talking about individuals who use love, which should be outgoing concern, but they use their love for others as a mask for acting on personal selfishness. So they start weaponizing this idea of love. For instance, we won't get too detailed. It's not necessary. However, I've used to teach high school, so I know things. I used to.
You went to high school.
I went to high school. That's right. And I've been a field pastor for a long time, and have a lot of friends who are. And there is a tendency, for instance, don't mean to speak too stereotypically, it actually does go both ways sometimes, but where you have boys who will try to manipulate girls by saying, well, hey, I love you. If you loved me, you would, and then they fill in the blank with whatever it is that they, that they're looking for. Trying
to pressure somebody into behavior they don't actually want to engage in, and then saying, what? I thought you loved me.
Exactly. I thought you had, outgoing concern for me. I have outgoing concern for you, when really they're not acting out of outgoing concern for this other person. They have a selfish desire that they're trying to fulfill, and they're using that as manipulation to try to get this other person to act in ways that they shouldn't.
Yep. Nope. Can't. I think that nailed it. I mean, I remember in high school, that was almost like if we had internet memes back then,
which back in our days with dinosaurs and stones and rocks, there were none.
I mean, that's a lot of guys. The pressure of, well, if you loved me, ... all kinds of behavior. Yep.
Yeah, which I remember trying to explain to my high school students, and I said, look, and I probably was being a little self-righteous as I said it, but I had a relationship talking with them. I said, look, you guys need to know, when you're telling each other you love each other, and I'm talking to 15, 16-year-olds, et cetera, say, oh, I love you. I said, let me be honest, most of you guys don't. I mean, you really don't. I said, I was trying to raise their view of what love is, that if love is this self-sacrificial, outgoing concern, then is that really what you're talking about? Or is your relationship really focused mainly on how the other person makes you feel when you're together, right? It really is. They say, I love you. What they mean is, I feel great when you're around, which is wonderful. When I'm around the woman I love, I feel great. But, there's times also when they're rougher or harder, or we have disagreement. And it doesn't mean in those times I don't love her. Love is something profound that survives that. Right. Even when the feelings aren't there, there's still the desire to seek the other person's welfare. And that's not what this is that we're talking about. It's not about the other person's welfare.
Another example of this that I'm reminded of is this idea of using love as kind of this, as you say, a mask for personal selfishness. I, again, will be generic for cause. Another minister I know well talked about a problem he had in one of his areas, and this is a long time ago. And I don't know all the details of it, and that's probably good because the principle, the principle still stands.
Right.
But there was a family, I think, that had moved into an area, and they kind of systematically went through the congregation, making people feel guilty that they weren't. They were kind of poor. Oh, if you have true Christian love, you'll help us in various ways, like financially and so on and so forth. And at first, I mean, that's a really great way to take advantage of Christians initially. You're out there working hard to help somebody who's kind of down and out. They've had some things not go their way. But then over time, you start to feel like there's a pattern to this, and that they're actually starting to take advantage of you.
Right.
And so that's a case where somebody's taking advantage of Christians truly trying to be loving and generous and helpful, but just for their own personal gains. I don't hope. My impression is that does not happen a lot, but I know we know enough ministry and enough examples to know that from time to time somebody kind of feeds off the system a little bit, if you will, taking advantage of people through the mask of love.
Right. And of course, all of us being human beings can be tempted to do the same thing. If I feel slighted sometimes, I can naturally question. It's like, well, does that person love me, mom or dad or my kids or my wife? But then to take this other step and start, it kind of brings up, we mentioned earlier before the podcast and talking about these, that we don't want to negate the fact that there are legitimate discussions that can be had by, like, couples, for instance, generally married, or frankly, couples who are serious about being married, about what it actually means to love another person. What does that equate to? What changes in one's life would be appropriate, say, motivated by those things? It's appropriate, husbands and wives, if one feels unloved because the other person's actions don't seem to be loving, well, rather than that, shunting that aside and thinking, well, it's wrong. Well, no, that's what dialogue is for, and actually discussing. But it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be an accusation. You don't love me because of this, but when this happens like this, I don't feel loved, and then talk about that. Maybe the feelings are what need work, or maybe the actions need work. But we're not trying to negate legitimate discussions of love and loving behavior. We're talking about where it's used manipulatively. And in fact, one of the guidelines you can use to try to see that is whether what's being discussed on either part really is in line with the laws and character of God. Because we mentioned earlier, God is love. And there's nothing that you would be asked to do, or there's nothing the other person would be motivated to ask, that's really grounded in love, that would go against God's laws, God's way of life, and God's character. You should not have to love someone, quote unquote, by violating God's laws. That's actually the opposite of love, because going in the opposite direction of God would be going in the opposite direction of love. Someone who's asking for anything in a way that doesn't reflect God's own character, that person is not acting in love. That's then the word. If the word love is bandied around in those circumstances, it's not being used accurately or honestly.
So if I try to understand what you're saying here, you kick this off with, say, the marriage relationship, although I would argue it doesn't, clearly it expands further than that in terms of like friend. You can have close friends.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I keep going back. This is probably the 10th time I've mentioned this on the podcast. The idea of the Ten Commandments being viewed as defining your relationship with God and defining your relationship with your neighbor. And the idea that so within any kind of friendship group, you're going to have boundaries,
Yes.
that each one, and it's kind of custom, kind of individualized for one, like with a friend, like guy friends, right? We can tease each other about our weight and things like that. And I wouldn't recommend actually having girlfriends if you're married, but that's the kind of thing you wouldn't say to them,
Right.
Just the boundaries can vary a little bit, but they're still within a certain realm.
Loving each other actually means willing to realize, hey, this person, we should have boundaries. Actually,
Yep.
boundaries help make love clearer.
Yeah, exactly. And I saw this in my own marriage, but I have seen this with other men as well. And since I know the male side of this equation a little bit better, I see one area that we're not always great about showing love to our spouses is being somewhat dismissive of their concerns.
Right.
There's
Right.
something that makes them nervous or worrisome. Well, we tend to view that through the prism of being a man, and it's like, well, that doesn't sound that hard. That whatever.
Right.
My wife hates talking on the phone, hates a voice conversation. I never understood it. Doesn't faze me. But then one day I had to realize, well, no, it doesn't faze you, Robinson, but it does your wife. And so that's an area where I tried to be more loving in our relationship by removing those situations.
Right. And if she had a conversation with you about that,
Right.
trying to explain it to you, she's not trying to manipulate you.
No.
She's sincerely, and it is kind of outgoing concern because, when you are in a marriage in this case, well, the health of the marriage is both of your concerns, and so you bring things up and you talk about them. No, we're talking about trying to manipulate someone to go in directions they really should not, directions that have nothing to do with actual love, but truly being selfish and trying to achieve something that God actually gives you no right to. I have to say, you said a while ago, I've probably said this like 10 times or so. I thought, oh, he's going to mention Jordan Peterson again.
No, I have to mention him in code now.
Well, and I should say to our audience, I think we've said it before, but we're getting serious about it. We do plan to do a podcast about what Jordan Peterson gets wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So it's things that frankly we wish he would get right. Yep. It would be great, if he did. But no, we're looking forward to talking about that.
All right, we're rounding third here.
Here we go. Third. Another way in which love is weaponized is in this concept that was brought up in the emails that were sent to us. This idea that, what's most important? Loving yourself. Loving yourself is the most important thing you can do. Now, I'm afraid someone's going to take a soundbite of that. Because that's not what we're saying. Rather, that's a weaponizing of love, and thinking of it as weaponizing is a bit different.
Yep. I hear a phrase like "love yourself," and it causes my brain to start melting. I'm like, what does that even mean? What does that look like?
Yeah. And going back to Mr. Armstrong, what he say love was? It's outgoing concern. Mm-hmm. It's not inward pointed concern. Godly love is outgoing concern. Jesus said in John chapter 15 and verse 13, "Greater love has no one than this, than to totally take care of number one and make sure that they are personally happy." That's not what he says. Rather, it says, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends." That is great love. It's looking towards others. It's not focusing on yourself. And so, Mr. Robinson, I ought to ask you, I know that I wrote some notes about this, but if someone were to say, maybe it's just befuddlement, maybe that's what you'll express, but if you heard some radio personality or podcaster or read some book and they said, what the most important thing is? You've got to love yourself. You got to love yourself above everything else. That's just what you got to do. What do you think they're even saying when they say something like that?
Well, that's exactly right. Like, that's the first question. I would have to say, well, what do you mean by that? Because one of the things that we do, a distinction I think that is important that we need to separate from this idea of like self-love and self-care and all that. You and I are not sitting here today saying that you shouldn't take time to invest in yourself and do things that are, encourage you and make you have a more positive outlook. I think author Brene Brown probably frames this the best, and it's with one word: shame. And I know that there are some people out there listening to this podcast who probably feel, I don't know if you would think of it as, if they necessarily think of it using this word of shame, but I find shame works the best. They just kind of don't feel like they measure up. They feel like they're not worthy of love and belonging. That's another phrase that she uses. And so let's come back to that. What these other people are talking about really is this, like, really turn internal focus onto only themselves and making sure that they're happy. And my only guess would be the more they try to make this happen, the more it doesn't happen, because like happiness really is a result.
Oh yeah. I remember Mr. Hernandez, he and I on a Charlotte Family Weekend many years ago, were assigned to conduct sessions for the mature singles, and we let people sort themselves. Are they a mature single or not? And he tackled the second one that day, and I sat in. Though I was not single, I still sat in, and I'm so glad I did. He tried to emphasize that the more you try to pursue personal happiness, the more it will elude you.
Yes.
You've got to focus on what God tells you to focus on, serving other people, looking more outwardly, and then happiness is always a byproduct of that. And I think you see it the way I do. To me, when someone says you've really got to love yourself, they're trying to encourage you to seek happiness by, for instance, accepting yourself the way you are, and don't feel bad for anything, don't feel guilty for anything. Just completely accept yourself the way you are and learn to be happy with that. Focus on taking care of number one. That's really the best thing you can do. And our theme here is on weaponizing love. And weaponizing implies a weaponizer, where someone is turning something into a different idea to harm others. And here I am going to say that this idea is the devil weaponizing love, because when you if God is love, if you can corrupt love as outflowing concern for others, you're corrupting the very idea of who and what God is. And if the devil turns love into focusing on your own wants, your own desires, your own passions, your own dreams, and nothing else, then he's actually taken godly love and turned it into a reflection of his own attitude, the devil's own attitude. And now he's convincing you that's the greatest love. Love the way I see it, as the devil. Right. So that's what I'm saying.
You know, there's a phrase that's shown up in a lot of Disney stuff, and Marvel as well, and not just limited to that, and that is just believe in yourself. And this is a message that often I was listening to a podcast, and this woman emphasized that this is especially directed at the girls for some reason. And the message is, you're fine as who you are. You don't need to make any changes. Just believe in yourself. And then those people, you know, if you grow up that way and really just believe in yourself, then every time you run into conflict with somebody else, the problem's not you. The problem is the other person. And this gets back to the heart of what bothers us here in God's church with the old hymn, which is, it's a popular one for a reason. Jesus, take me as I am. There's a whole mainstream Christian idea that's fundamentally from the rejection of God's law. Okay, we don't believe you. You know, the law was done away with. Well, if the law is done away with, what do you have to do? Well, nothing. And Jesus, just take me as I am. What's funny about that is I know there's people like William Lane Craig who would tell you can't just stay the same as you are. You need to make improvements in your life, which is a certain an irony there to their whole take on the law. But I think that's what we're kind of talking about here. When I hear, especially as we've thought through it here, talking about it on the podcast, you know, loving yourself, that's really that's kind of code for you don't need to make any changes. And everybody needs to make changes.
Right. Exactly.
In our marriages, we have to adapt as we go along. In all our relationships, we have to adapt. You and I have known each other for probably about 10 years. And as our working relationship changed somewhat over the years, each one of us had to adapt to it.
Yep.
You know?
Yep. And we're not even married.
Yeah.
We're not this kind of church.
Well, there was the idea of a work spouse, you know.
Oh, that's right. You know,
which at first it offended me, and then when I thought through it, I was like, well, that's not preposterous.
See, I was kind of the other way around. I got the idea, and I thought, I get the idea there, but then it's like I do not like adding the word spouse. Frankly, I know of too many workplace situations that turned into adultery. It's like, yeah, okay, I don't. Well, like that. I don't like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying.
You know what I'm saying?
Well,
so
yeah. No, that's a good point.
But I get it.
I wasn't even thinking necessarily along gender lines, literally gender lines. Like you've mentioned several times, and I actually really appreciate this. In certain roles, you're the wife. You know, here at the church, Mr. Weston is the leader of the church, and he's kind of dad or the husband, as it were. Right. And our role is to support him like a wife would.
Right.
And so that's kind of why it made some. That's why it made some sense to me. And so, for example, like every so often, I'd hear a woman kind of understandably grousing about, submitting and all this kind of thing. And I thought, we men have to submit too. It's just the relationship is different. The circumstances are different.
Right.
But you're the head of the editorial department, and it is my job to support you and do what you need to get done, so you can focus on leading our department. And the same thing with Mr. Webb. There's lots of situations
in that makes sense. Regrettably, like when the word work spouse came into play, it was really more. As I understood it, those you have relationships with at the office who takes care of you like a spouse does, but not in that way, like, brings you the coffee the time you need it and remembers those appointments. But it really is not, the actual kind of what we're thinking.
Well, then I've probably misunderstood what it was, and that's probably for the best.
On this particular topic, Satan wants you to put yourself first. I mean, just straight up. And we'll talk about what we're not talking about in a moment. I do think that's important. And before we wrap up, we'll make sure we do, because that can be misunderstood. But the fact is, the devil wants you to put yourself above everybody else. And I wish I'd have thought to bring the articles. When I replied to one of those who wrote into the podcast, I mentioned these articles, but I read one in a sermon recently. Like the New York Times had an article about a woman. She was a law professor and a lawyer, and she was divorced, but she and her husband shared custody, and she was straight up. Even the title essentially said, "I put my job above my kids." And she explains in the article why. And she says, look, if it weren't for my job, I would feel empty. And yes, my kids suffer for that, but they understand. And it's important that I take care of myself. And she completely talked about how her kids suffered for her job. But you know what? That's just too bad. It's important. Versus, as I mentioned in the sermon, the advice I was given by someone, not even in the church, but they were so right when we started having children. We had Jonathan on the way, and and I was trying to figure out how to afford to have my wife home while I was a teacher in Texas, because we wanted her to be able to stay home when we have children and not work outside the home. And thankfully that guy told me, he said, look, they can get another teacher for those kids. Your kid cannot get another father. You are
only
that
you
child.
Can be
only
a father.
You can be the father to that child. And it hurt, but it was true. Same thing with this woman. You know what? They can find another law firm. They can find another lawyer, but she didn't get that. And so she was literally putting her job above her children in that regard. And the devil loves that. But that's this kind of theme. You've got to take care of yourself. You've got to, and you see movies and stories that essentially where the hero is the one that put their desires above everybody else. And they're the celebrated person somehow.
That's what I hated about the movie La La Land.
Yes, I agree.
For those of you listening who have not seen it, which we are not recommending. Trust me. It was fundamentally a story about two younger people. I mean, they're clearly in their 20s, who meet each other, fall in love, but especially as you pointed out, the woman more than the guy focuses on their career, and that was more important than this loving relationship they had developed, and they sacrificed that so that they go be successful in their careers.
Right, absolutely. It was a weird message, but fitting with where I think the culture is going in terms of teaching people, make sure your dreams are fulfilled above all other concerns. And so we do want to make sure before we go on that we talk about what I have listed in the notes here. We call a few of courses. For instance, of course you should take care of yourself. We're not saying you shouldn't take care of yourself. You should seek to have a healthy body. You should seek to have a healthy mind. But is that a matter of take care of number one thinking? No. In fact, you can't help other people if you're not in a decent amount of shape. Plus, who owns your body and your mind? That's God's property. You have a responsibility to treat it well.
That's right. I've talked to people a couple of times who kind of felt really down about themselves, and they don't feel good about themselves. And as Brene Brown put it, they don't feel worthy of love and belonging. And so what advice would you have to people like that? One of the things I have said before, which I see is also in the notes, is anybody who is out there listening to this podcast, regardless of how you feel about yourself, especially we're talking about the negative emotion, you don't feel worthy for whatever reason, you are made in God's image. And that
Right.
alone makes you have tremendous value.
Oh, thank you. That's what I'd like to focus on because one, we're definitely not saying you should hate yourself. In fact, not in the sense of wanting to cause yourself harm or think that you're not worthy of being alive. You know, if you get to the end of the book of Job, Job says that he's repulsed by himself at that point. But you got to say he wasn't saying he hates himself.
Right.
What he's saying is he thought he was all that, and then he was shown by God, no, Job, I am all that. You are not that. And so Job had just fallen down from a position where he was essentially equating himself with God self-righteously. And he's relative to that. He's like, no, I am
Yep.
low. I
Well-
am not you. But that's not the same as degrading yourself and hating yourself
Right.
like you're some sort of horrible specimen of human being.
I like to think, and I'm definitely reading into this a little bit, that what Job was really found abhorrent was this attitude he had gotten into,
Oh,
where
certainly.
in the process of going through Job, it gets revealed to him and to all of us, recorded for all eternity. But again, I like how Brene Brown frames it, the difference between guilt and shame by her definition. So, for example, shame, you've done you stayed out way too late and you didn't study and you have a test the next morning. Shame is I'm a terrible person. Guilt is I've done something foolish, like the behavior versus the person. So if you find yourself being really negative and down on yourself, I would encourage you to actually reframe in your own mind your phrasing and be like, when you've done something dumb, it's not that you're just inherently a worthless idiot. I mean, there's a Greek word for that, moros, that we get the word moron from. I don't know why I said that. But but really you should reframe it in your mind as that wasn't a good idea, or
Right.
I've done something foolish, or and try to turn it as positive as you can. And I know that can be really hard when you're feeling really down about yourself, but it's like, all right, we're not gonna do that again.
Yeah, I appreciate Brene Brown's observations in that regard. I feel there's a broader sense of the word shame because the Bible sometimes condemns those who lack a sense of shame or shamefacedness, but that's really it. Sometimes we do actions and it's related to guilt and such, as trying to say, but not as if somehow you shouldn't even exist. There is an anchor for having a right understanding of yourself. The problem is what the world is selling is that if you don't love yourself enough, that's the problem. But that's not it. Mr. Robinson hit on it. There's at least two things to focus on. And the most fundamental one that applies to every human on earth is that you're made in God's image. God actually values you. The reason he sent his son to die and that he and Jesus Christ had this plan was to have you live with them for all eternity.
Right.
So you don't value yourself for all the worldly reasons, which are because your dreams are the best or this or that. Well, no, you're just like me and Mr. Robinson, goofy human beings bumping around on earth trying to figure things out. You anchor your value in what God thinks of you.
Yes.
And God knows you for who you actually are. You hide nothing from him. And yet in the presence of all that, he still decided that his son would die so that you could be with him.
I mean, tell me if I'm going too far with this, but I would argue what God the Father did for us was sacrifice the most valuable possession he had.
Yeah, here we're getting to it. It's kind of funny. What Mr. Robinson just said made me think of Mr. Weston's John 3:16 booklet, where he talks about the sacrifice the Father made as well. It wasn't just Jesus Christ sacrificing. If you think that's a sacrifice, and of course it was what Jesus Christ did, but imagine being the Father, seeing your son go through these things. Not only does Mr. Weston talk about that, but he actually talks about it, I believe, I tried to check earlier because I wanted to refer to this, in a telecast he titled The Greatest Love, where he talks about these things, and I think he refers to the Whitney Houston song where she sings the greatest love of all is, essentially learning to love yourself, as she says that in the song, which is the opposite of the greatest love. Absolutely, the Father loves you that much. Jesus Christ loves you that much. They were truly willing to give up the most you could give. Jesus Christ was an eternal being. There is no higher level of existence, and he literally died. The eternal one died so that you could be in his kingdom for all eternity. In Galatians 2:20, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Christ lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. See, Paul is anchoring his sense of his own value, not in Paul. If anything, Paul looked at all the stuff he used to learn before his relationship with God truly began. He said, I count it as garbage. I count all that stuff as garbage. He anchored, rather, his sense of value in terms of the fact that God valued him the way he did and how his life is now tied with Christ. There are things in us that we shouldn't love. I got things about myself I do not love. I got things about myself that God is helping me to extinguish, so they're not a part of me for all eternity, right? We're all growing and imperfect. And there's other parts of me that God is helping to grow. God is helping to make larger and grander, just like any father would with their child. But, even with my children, I mean, Mr. Robinson, this will probably shock you with your perfect children, but my children aren't perfect. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. Mr. Robinson never claimed his children are perfect. My children are not perfect because they came from a dad and a mom who were not perfect for their parents. But you know what? For all my children's imperfections, I never not loved them. I loved them, the collection of what they were. But even as I loved them as a whole, I still worked to help make them better, to help them become the kind of version they would want to be of themselves. So we're not talking about God pretending that you're only good things. We're not talking about God somehow ignoring the fact there's bad things about you.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about God seeing you as a whole person and loving you, but not like the world would say, loving you so much just exactly the way you are so you stay that way forever, but loving you enough to jump in and live life with you and work with you to help make you better. That's real love.
You touched on it just a minute ago, and we've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I love the example that Mr. O'Gwen often riffed, if I can say that, riffed on, of his disciples at the time were beginning to think there wasn't a future in this, this discipleship, and they were going back to their original jobs of fishing. And, they go back out on the lake, and they're out there in their boats, and they're catching nothing. And Christ strolls up and tells them to cast the net in an area that makes no sense to them as experienced fishermen. And they catch so much fish in one haul of the net that they have to bring another boat over to bring it in. Almost breaks their gear. And it really hit Peter hard, and he came over and talked to Christ. And the sentiment he expressed was one of, well, if you just understood what a bad person I was, you wouldn't be around me.
Right.
And the point Mr. O'Gwen always made and brought out, which really has meant a lot to me, was Christ always knew who Peter was. He just needed Peter to recognize that. And with that recognition, we shouldn't just stay there. And I don't want to say wallow, because I don't want it to trivialize when we don't feel good about ourselves. But we have to work hard to not stay there. One of the points that Mr. O'Gwen brought out was you can't really help somebody and teach them until they become realistic about themselves. And then they're teachable. And I going back again to the sacrifice that Christ made, the Father had to make the sacrifice, but of course Christ had to divest himself temporarily of his glory and come and live a human life, and he went through the experiences we did. Why? Because you have so much value and so much potential that he made that sacrifice as well, including, all the way through the crucifixion, which was the brutal thing as the Romans could come up with as a way to execute a certain class of people. So I understand not feeling great about yourself, but just know that God views you as a very valuable person with an incredible potential, and maybe at least start there. What would you say? I think you have some more points to make, but what would you say to somebody that came to you and they really were able to deeply express to you how they just don't feel like they have a lot of value and they don't feel good about themselves? Are there actual tangible tips that you could give to them as a way to start digging themselves out of that hole and that feeling?
Oh wow, that's like a whole nother podcast, Mr. Robinson. Here's we wrap up. Let's do but just to say something. Okay. I would say the things that we're really talking about is there's a reason that Paul tries to anchor us in not trying to lay a foundation for understanding of ourselves on us, but on God's love for us, God's plan for us, God's calling us, God's desire for us, because He's a constant in that. I try to ask people, I don't, you may not love yourself. God loves you. I mean, God loves you a great deal, and He's not in confusion about who you are. I love the point you just made about Peter. Christ was working with Peter for 3.5 years, and then continued working with him when he went up to heaven, right? Because he was there running, as the apostle, right? The leading apostle there amongst the apostles.
But not Peter went to heaven.
Not Peter. That's right. Jesus Christ did. But it's not like He called Peter, made him an apostle, and was working with him thinking, well, I hope I can get this guy in a shape that I'm going to love him one day. Yeah. No, He loved him from the beginning, but that doesn't mean He wasn't working to improve him. Of course He was. That's the whole point. But it's like your kids. Your kids can be really obnoxious when they're young. And it's not like, I'm going to work with my child and train them and teach them so that maybe one day I can love them. No, you love them from the beginning, that's why you're working with them. Yep. You can not love them in a lot of ways. In fact, not working with them is a lack of love.
It'd be like pulling the plug on your 2-year-old. This just isn't working out. I just don't. They're so they're so young and ornery and rambunctious. I don't see how this.
Yeah, just look. Hey, 2-year-old. It's not you. It's me. And we're just gonna have to call things off. It's interesting because often when we're struggling, we're anchoring. Our sense of ourself and everything else. The world tells you love yourself, and deep down we know we're faulty and we're broken, and there's times we don't like things we see. And yet the world and the devil through the world is trying to convince us to make an idol of ourselves so that we become the supreme target of our love.
Just believe in yourself.
Just believe in yourself. And you know what? We're faulty. Like Mr. Senna said that one time in a feast sermon. I can't even guarantee I can get to my kid's football game on time. And you're not worthy of being on that pedestal where you're above everything. I'm not worthy of that. Mr. Robinson's not worthy of that. Only God is worthy of that. And so rather than anchoring our love in ourselves as the supremo thing, we anchor our love in God and Jesus Christ as a supremo thing, and everything else is set in order in the world. It's like when He says, you can't come to me unless you hate father and mother, son, daughter, and the rest. It doesn't mean we literally hate them. It means we put Jesus Christ first above them, and then our relationship with all of them is put in their right, healthy place where it can flourish and thrive. And that's the same with your relationship to yourself. You put God and Jesus Christ first, and then you're in a place to put your relationship to yourself and other people exactly where they need to be. What is a recommendation you would have, Mr. Robinson? Again, I do think we could probably make a whole podcast out of this, but let's at least leave viewers with a concrete point. If someone really is struggling with how much they dislike themselves, right? Rather than going the world's route of just love yourself more, which doesn't work. What's something concrete that you would recommend?
Got it. Well, hopefully we've done a good job in this podcast, or good enough, of explaining how a real internal turn isn't a good long-term prospect. So what would you do? Well, we just talked about the incredible sacrifice that the Father made, the incredible sacrifice that Christ made, all because He feels we're worthwhile. But that's not all. It's not like He just made this sacrifice and voila. He also said, another important part of Christ coming and living a life as a human was to set the model and the example, which was, again, what? Outflowing concern and care for us. And that's our model. So I think what I'm inclined to recommend to people out there who might be struggling is find somewhere, somehow in your life, in your congregation, in your family, maybe if you're a little bit older at work, there's always somebody struggling, somebody you can help, and just take what's going on in your life and really try to focus it outward on, well, what can I do to maybe make such and such a person's life just a little bit better, or serve them in some way. It reminds me, I can't remember if I've used this example on the podcast or not. I'm already getting paranoid, Mr. Smith, about reusing examples and stories on the podcast, but I remember I was still pretty new to giving sermons, and I had a sermon I was going to give, and I had given it a couple of times, gotten some really, really positive feedback on it. So I knew that it resonated with the audience. And it was announcements were going on and drawing to an end. I'm standing in the back of the hall, and I have my Bible and my notes, and I feel my anxiety level rising. And that was, I mean, don't get me wrong. When I first started doing sermonettes for the first few years, there was always a healthy dose of nerves going up there. But I had kind of, to some degree, gotten past that, and the anxiety level rose to one that I took note of, and I thought, why am I feeling this way? Getting these nerves going up before I'm about to speak on this for the sermon. And I realized it really did hit me. And a part of this was because where it was I was going to give this sermon in an area where I had grown up and I knew people, and I really wanted to do a good job. Now, that's not original, of course. Everybody wants to do a good job. But like what I realized was the focus had turned internally on myself. And it was more like, I want to make sure I do a good job so that I look good. I don't mean like, I hope everyone understands what I mean. Like, not look good. I was concerned about how I was going to be perceived by the audience.
Sure.
And so it's one of the few times I've actually been like this level-headed in some ways when feeling like that. And I thought, no, Robinson. I think I do call myself Robinson in my inner monologue.
I call myself Smith.
Okay.
That's funny.
Robinson. You spent a lot of time researching this. You spent a lot of time organizing this material. People have come and talked to you about how much they appreciate it and learn from it. You have put together material that's going to help somebody today. And as soon as I turned it more to, I am just serving the audience, which in this case is the congregation there in the unnamed city, and it was incredible. The anxiety almost immediately evaporated. As soon as I switched my mindset from worrying about how I was going to perceive towards, no, something I'm going to do today will help somebody in the audience. I know it will because it has in the past. And I relaxed. I went up, and guess what? It flowed nicely, and I once again had people thanking me for it, which sounds... Let's like, I'm not trying to just be self-aggrandizing here, but
you're trying to say there was evidence that was truly helpful. Yep. That's what you're saying.
And so that's just the example I would present to our listeners out there as a way, if you can, the more you can turn your internal gaze off of yourself. It doesn't mean that there aren't things you should do for yourself. You know, my wife's an introvert, she needs to have some time to herself without my yapping all the time.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. But the outgoing view can really change your overall mindset.
All right. Focus on what you can do for other people. Get your eyes off yourself and think about other people. Yep. Oh, that is very practical. Thank you, Mr. Robinson, for sharing that with all of us and with me too. I appreciate it. I know I've heard it before actually, but it means a lot hearing it from you right now. Well, let's go ahead and try and wrap up. Let's attempt. All right. So love is only a positive, good thing if, it's a big if, it is understood to mean what God says it means. People ignore God, then they twist love and try to bring God back in once they've twisted love to try to force you into accepting their version of love. Oh, you believe in God and everything. Well, you must be loving or you're a hypocrite. But when they say loving, it's something they've twisted in ignorance or absolute avoidance of what God actually says about love. But only if you stick with God from the beginning. And since He is love, let Him teach you what love means and how to love other people, and how to see yourself the way He sees you. It's only then that you're going to be on the right track to truly becoming a loving person, truly loving other people, and even having a healthy relationship with yourself as well.
Smith and Robinson.